Hey guys, it's Poppy, Sesame, and Raisin, three angry bagels with way too much free time. We've noticed a lot of rampant misinformation being propagated in our communities and online communities worldwide about BLM and the concept of defunding the police. As we are living in crazy times right now, we are seeing less and less people talk about this. We need to not let that happen. This should not be treated as a seasonal trend or aesthetic. It must be at the forefront of our minds until these systemic issues are eradicated. To do our part in correcting these misconceptions and bringing back attention to this issue, however small it may be, we want to discuss what these terms mean and why they are significant.
Hey y'all, it's Sesame here, and I'm gonna be going over a general history of American policing. So, to understand this, we need to go back to its roots. Let's start with the founding of America. Too far back, you may be asking? Yeah, we were surprised too, but to understand the systemic nature of such an issue, we gotta first accept it's been propagated since the founding of this country. So, let's throw it back to roughly around the 18th century. Early northern colony policing was influenced by those of European systems. English policing was highly community-based, meaning civilians were in charge of law enforcement. In America, there are two forms called the Watch and the Big Stick. Interesting name there. The Watch was an informal and communal type of policing made up of a disorganized set of volunteers, while the Big Stick was a private for-profit type of policing with a slightly more organized structure, but still very disorganized. These early forms of policing were to warn of impending danger. Boston was the earliest one in 1636, and it ended up being not very useful. The police mostly just slept and drank on the job. It was, by definition, voluntary, but it was mostly used by people to avoid military duty or people were forced by their town as punishment. Now in the South, things were slightly different. Policing started out as a way to control the slave population. This was known as the Southern Slave Patrol. They would bring back runaway slaves, they organized formal terror to stop slave protests, and they used tactics in an attempt to control the slave population. And even after slavery was abolished, the police focused on enforcing Jim Crow laws. By the 1830s, police were finally centralized, and by the 1880s, there was a formal police force in nearly every city. These early modern versions of the police were publicly funded bureaucratic organizations. They were no longer voluntary or people forced to do a night watch. They were full-time employees, and they were working by more structured rules. But you may be asking, why did unification start now? Well, on the surface level, it's because there's a population boom. With a higher population, it was harder to control crimes such as public drinking and prostitution. But on a deeper level, a larger police force was used to enact stronger social control. Population growth was coming in from the influx of German, Irish, and Chinese immigrants, as well as people who were formerly enslaved. These groups were seen as social disorders, and those in power wanted to maintain their definition of the collective good. People in power tended to be politicians with economic motives, so not much has changed. The modern police force not only provided an organized, centralized body of men, and they were all men, legally authorized to maintain order. It also provided the illusion that the order was being maintained under the rule of law, not at the whim of those with economic power. That's a quote by Dr. Gary Potter, an associate dean and researcher in the College of Social Justice at Eastern Kentucky University. There are a few more quotes by him later throughout. The American population continued to grow and became increasingly urbanized, and with these urban areas, civil unrest continued to grow. Police began to watch out for the dangerous class, which happened to comprise mostly of immigrants and free Black Americans. The dangerous class was often used as a scapegoat by politicians to blame crimes on. During this period of time, police departments were extremely corrupt in their actions. They would help organize election fraud. They had payoffs to allow crimes. They organized crimes for bribes. Loyal political operatives became police officers. Promotions were sold, and they were quick to use force. Worker rights became a stronger issue as the 20th century raged on. Many exploited workers fought for unions or had labor union strikes. The economic elite continued to work with the police and prevent strikes by calling them riots or using force. They used words such as riots so that the blame would be shifted on the workers instead of those in power who created these unjust systems. And police tried to stop strikes from occurring altogether by issuing public order arrests. The only effective political strategy available to exploited workers was what economic elites refer to as rioting. There's a lot going on. There are 3 structural debates happening within police departments. These debates talked about whether police should wear uniforms, carry firearms, and exactly how much force they should be using. Civilians, they sided on yes to uniforms, no to firearms, and not much force, if any at all. On the other hand, police officers said no to uniforms as they were scared that it would make them too identifiable and cause mob violence against them. They said yes to firearms because some police officers were already carrying them informally before it was legally authorized. And the economic elite, who usually backed police departments, said yes to more force to create stronger control. During this time period, there was a lot of talk about change. You had the debates from previously, but then there was also talk about reforming the entire police system. The first stage of this was what some may call involving they want to hold police accountable, they want higher surveillance for police officers, they want more selective processes on who became an officer, and they want training or better training for new recruits. A big goal of this whole reforming the police departments was to really ease the faults of the police departments off politicians' shoulders, because at this time, police departments and politicians were very intertwined. Professionalism sought to reform the corrupt nature of policing and its ties to politics during the 20th century. However, it ended up backfiring pretty badly. Professionalism was a more military style of policing. There was more management that was more centralized and structured. Specific squads or sectors were created for different departments. This whole division caused a lot of tension between admin, police, and civilians. The crime control tactics recommended by professionalism movement, such as aggressive stop and frisk procedures, created widespread community resentment, particularly among young minority males, who were most frequently targeted. The results of professionalism led a lot of police officers to want to create police unions. But this happened during the 1970s, which there was an economic collapse. So this economic collapse caused an increase in crime. But politicians spun this narrative so that police unions were the ones at fault for this increase in crime. So police admin and authority once again took over and created tailorization, which was a continuation of professionalism, and it focused on breaking down all functions of policing into sectors. And, well, it backfired as well, as it just continued to alienate the community from the police system. Now today, in our current era of policing, we got a combination of most of that. However, after 9/11, there's a larger emphasis on surveillance and catching the criminal before anything is even committed.
In order to understand the police abolition movement of today, we must first come to terms with its roots, which, although do extend into many aspects and places in American history, we will focus on the movement that took place in Pennsylvania. Think about this. It's 1905, and the US has established its very first militarized police force in Pennsylvania, developed out of the direct influence of imperialist American warfare. In fact, almost all the officers that took part in this force came directly from the US military itself. Most of them were, of course, born in the United States, and their motto was a cute, catchy little slogan going, "One American can lick 100 foreigners," according to the historian Thomas Repetto. Yeah, that doesn't sound too great for the foreigners, does it? In fact, it wouldn't be that far-fetched for us to assert that this demonstrates foreigner and other resentment being an early and integral aspect of the American police force, setting a precedent for events to come. Okay, now it's 1906. At this point, our all-American state police has accumulated a lot of ill will by shooting labor strikers and escaping accountability. When troopers shot strikers in Mount Carmel, the lieutenant in command was arrested for assault and battery. However, he was later exonerated of all charges. What may be worse, somehow is that the governor at the time expressed support for this. In general, the state police were used to suppress labor strike activity and were a weapon of the elite in Pennsylvania. They hardly ever faced consequences for their actions. Now, it's 1914. There has been a decrease in immigration to the United States. The Coal Wars, which were a series of conflicts between miners and the police, emerged. Reports of miners being severely beaten and murdered by the public and private police became common knowledge. State police carelessly gunned down tent cities, resulting in, and I quote, killing or wounding of women and children. Sexual assaults by officers became very common then. And after witnessing a 70-year-old citizen getting beaten down, an American trade unionist named James H. Moore proposed legislation to abolish the Pennsylvania State Police. In 1928, the ACLU published a pamphlet titled The Shame of Pennsylvania on the basis that police were allowed to abuse their power without inquiry or punishment. However, it was ultimately concluded that without a fearless governor, abolishing the police was not conceivable. So that was then, but what about today? What can we say about the current police abolition movement? Well, for starters, efforts to quite literally abolish the police in current day are quite limited. When people say they want to defund the police, they mean that they want to limit the power that police officers wield in current day and put a cap on the amount of harm the police can potentially cause. People want to change the manner in which police are trained and carry out their duties in an effort to hold them more accountable for their actions and make the country a little safer for its citizens. So, how could we start achieving this? Well, for starters, we could start by ceasing the increasing of police budgets every year. $100 billion is spent on policing every single year. That's insane. What's even worse, however, is that this is usually at the expense of healthcare and educational programs. Additionally, increasing police department budgets has not actually shown to increase the efficiency or number of crimes police can solve. So maybe we can stop doing that. Another way to make a change is to lengthen the time required to train and become a police officer. We give way too much of a responsibility to cops and their ability to solve a great portion of society's problems. This is already an issue, but combined with the lack of training required to become a police officer, you're placing individuals who are either severely unprepared or severely unfit for the job in the driver's seat.
Hey everybody, it's Raisin. Before diving deep into the Defund the Police movement, it's important to understand the structure of our current police system. First, we'll look into the application system and the general course of the police academy. The requirements to apply are that you must be at least 18 to 21 years of age and you must have had a minimum of 2 years college education, but having a bachelor's degree is recommended. You also must not have any previous felonies and misdemeanors. In addition, you will have to go through multiple background checks and pass a psychological screening. Up to this point, things sound fairly fine. But we have to consider that it is difficult to fully determine whether a person is fit for a career in the police force just by an application. So more people end up being quote-unquote weeded out in police academy, and this is where things get interesting. According to a study conducted from 2011 to 2013 by the Bureau of Justice Statistics on law enforcement training, excluding field training, the average length of a basic and law enforcement training program was about 840 hours, or 21 weeks. To put this into perspective, beauticians spend around 1,000 hours to earn their certification. I'll get back to why these statistics are important, but in the meantime, keep them in the back of your mind. Now, let's take a look at this table. Police recruits are trained 168 hours on weapons, defensive tactics, and the use of force compared to the 21 hours they spend on agency policies, de-escalation tactics, and crisis intervention strategies. When recruits are trained 8 times more in violence and force than ways to de-escalate a situation, they will be accustomed to relying on that use of force in their future law enforcement career because they spent more time practicing and training with it. In addition to this, 90% of academies, including training on domestic violence with an average about 13 hours of training, mental illness with around 10 hours of training, sexual assault with around 6 hours of training, and domestic preparedness and terrorism with 9 hours of training, crimes against children with 6 hours of training, and victim response with 5 hours of training, and gangs with 4 hours of training. We are requiring police officers to take the role of professional psychologists, therapists, and social workers when their training demonstrates the opposite, emphasizing more use of weapons and the use of force. We need to divert some funding for police to the government institutions and people that work on community development through the previously mentioned professions, and more. Through other trends, we can see that there is a steady increase in the use of weapons. The hours of training needed for firearm skills increased from 63 to 71 hours during the years of 2006 to 2013, while in contrast, there was a decrease in criminal and constitutional law patrol procedure training, more specifically from 58 to 52 hours. Prioritizing firearm skills over procedures in the law directly demonstrates how over time, the police have been creating a system that values weapons over actually being mindful of the law. Moreover, only 30% of academies had a mandatory field segment after graduating from academy. This field segment, or field training, which is similar to an internship, is what allows recruits to apply the practical implications of law enforcement and how to better accustom themselves with the professional culture of being a law enforcement officer. However, when less than half of the police academies in the US require recruits to grow accustomed to putting their training into practice, it does not better prepare police recruits for their jobs. Now, going back to that statistic I wanted you to keep in the back of your mind, when a beautician has more hours to learn their practice compared to a police, it highlights that the police system is not doing enough right now to ensure that police and police recruits are truly qualified for their jobs. The job of a police officer is life-threatening and is more nuanced than that of a beautician, and yet, the beauticians are given more time to practice and learn their jobs. This isn't to say that all officers are terrible people, but rather police officers have not been trained with the highest standards for their jobs. Defunding the police means diverting a portion of the funds set for police to social services, community centers, trauma centers, and more. Once you look into specific city and state budgets, you can see just how much money is going towards the police. In 2017, according to the US Census of Governments, around $115 billion was spent towards the police by state and local governments. Currently, the money invested in policing is not going towards reforming it, but rather sustaining it. That sounds obvious, but hear me out. If we want to understand this movement, we have to understand it on a community and city level. As an example, take the LA City budget versus the LA County budget. LA City spent $2.2 billion on police, whereas LA County spent around $2 billion. In LA City, around 50% of unrestricted revenue was spent towards the police. To add on, in the 2020 to 2021 budget for LA City, out of the $10 billion budget, $3.14 billion is allocated to the police. That is relatively 30% of the budget just for police. To give that much importance to policing is simply not necessary because it highlights that police need to sustain themselves. Rather than prioritize policing, we have to prioritize different cases and crimes that cause policing to exist in the first place. When we focus on promoting mental health, educational opportunities, trauma facilities, housing, and violence prevention programs, we can build healthier and more stable communities. That's why sustaining the police is not the answer, but by defunding it, we can reform the community around it. But change needs to occur soon, or else our government will continue funding the police. State and local spending on police rose from $42 billion in 1977 to $115 billion in 2017 in inflation-adjusted dollars, and around 2/3, in some cases more, is reserved for salaries. In addition, though cost of living does demonstrate that places like Maryland and California have higher spending, whereas Arkansas and West Virginia have lower spending, the proportion of spending towards police is generally higher than other departments. So now that we understand that we must defund the police on a local level, It's important to bring up the point that most police do not live in the cities they serve. An article by 538 mentions a study of the largest police forces of 75 US cities. In total, 60% of police officers did not live in the city they worked in. Moreover, the percentage of officers who live in the city is around 49% of Black police officers, 47% of Hispanic police officers, and just 30% of white officers. When we look into cities with largely Black populations, 57% of Black officers reside there, compared to 35% of white officers. When police do not live in the cities they work in, it means that they will spend the funding from their jobs to the cities they live in. These police then use the funding money that is supposed to go towards the city they work in to pay taxes and fund their more developed cities that they live in. Overall, there is a huge budget towards policing in the United States that needs to be questioned not only on a local level, but on a national level. Now, let's move on to specific policing laws, or more so, laws that ironically protect police from the law. I think this is one of the most interesting topics of modern policing, and so let's just jump into it. The law of police is very unpredictable, and it is understandable that mistakes happen. But the extent of how far the law will go to justify a police's actions is, well, not good. There's an actual document called the Law Enforcement Officer's Bill of Rights, which basically allows police to get away with a lot of things. The exact laws themselves vary for different states, but when a police officer is called into question or accused, they are given this sort of cooling off period before they even answer allegations, something that the public would not normally receive. In some states, the Law Enforcement Officer's Bill of Rights says that, and I quote, "Law enforcement officers shall, if disciplinary action is expected, be notified of the investigation, the nature of the alleged violation, and be notified of the outcome of the investigation and the recommendations made to superiors by the investigators." Take some time to process that. This is basically saying that the police accused of misconduct will not only know the course of investigation, but they will be recommended what steps to take based on an already determined result of the investigation. They will know the result beforehand and will receive help on how to act accordingly. What's wrong with this is that normal citizens do not receive this sort of treatment, and we can clearly see that this is solely to protect the police despite the misconduct. Another part of this says, law enforcement officers shall have the opportunity to comment in writing on any adverse materials placed in his or her personal file. This means that anything written in a law enforcement officer's file, whether they are previous violations or misconduct, can be changed and altered. This is why police officers can be transferred to another department or have files that don't accurately represent their career performance. To add on, citizen review boards are not used to investigate the police officer. Though these rights are not used for criminal investigations, it's important to understand that by the time a criminal investigation is called, there has already been an internal investigation, which demonstrates that these so-called rights would protect police officers even in a criminal investigation. Another way that police are protected is through qualified immunity. As said by the case of Pearson versus Callahan, qualified immunity balances two important interests: the need to hold public officials accountable when they exercise power irresponsibly, and the need to shield officials from harassment, distraction, and liability when they perform their duties reasonably. But going more in-depth, qualified immunity can basically protect government officials and police from lawsuits against them by only allowing lawsuits that demonstrate the officials violated a clearly established statutory, meaning that the law had to be previously enacted or written, or some kind of constitutional right. The court can deem whether a right was or was not clearly established. They basically hypothesize and ask themselves whether a reasonable official would have known that the official's conduct violated the plaintiff's rights. But this method does not, 1. define what a reasonable individual or official is, and 2. emphasizes the perspective of the official rather than the plaintiff. In addition, this method applies the law in force at the time of the alleged violation, but not the law in effect when the court considers the case. This, once again, protects the officer from being held accountable. Whew, I know that was a lot to take in, but these are all reasons why we have to defund the police. We need to instead use that money towards our community and start holding police officers accountable for their actions. We cannot live in a system that sustains, but we need a system that progresses, and that is not what the current police system is living up to.
So, I guess it's time to talk about pro-police propaganda, or copoganda. It's basically a way to counter the arguments and progress that BLM and other Black activist groups have fought for. It stems from either a casual lack of understanding to casual ignorance to malicious bad faith collectivism and, dare I say, racism. To be clear, copaganda should not be taken seriously. Copaganda isn't this wide variety of seasoned and well-formed arguments. It's honestly more like a collection of bad takes and talking points. It's not hard to see the flaws in copaganda, but if you don't know what the talking points are, a copagandist may be able to win an argument with you, and perhaps even convince you, not by the merits of their argument, but by the manner in which they present information to you. So, let's not let that happen. Let's talk about perhaps one of the most egregious examples of copaganda. It's called 1350. If this is your first time hearing these numbers in that order, first of all, you are very lucky. And second of all, I apologize in advance, because 1350 really is a particularly special talking point. People on the internet basically have a history of peddling out the notion that even though African Americans make up only about 13% of the population of the United States, they are, in reality, committing 50% of the crimes. They use this to explain or justify A, the notion of African Americans acting in accordance to community values or inclinations, which is, for the record, racist. It is racist to assume that a certain group of people are simply more inclined to commit crimes or be violent inherently. B, if a community is committing so many crimes, it's hardly the fault of white cops or white law-abiding citizens, now is it? Which is reductive reasoning. But C, perhaps most dangerously, it creates a hero complex amongst misguided white individuals that believe a race war is imminent, perpetuated by African Americans on whites. This can lead them to take drastic measures to save the white race, or so they perceive. Take Dylan Roof, for example, a 21-year-old white man that murdered 9 Black parishioners after walking into a Black church in June of 2015. The reasoning behind his terrible actions are, as I quote, Roof saw himself as a victim standing up for oppressed whites, not as an aggressor. He had a racist awakening spurred by online research he did about the 2012 murder of the Black high school student Trayvon Martin. As he wrote in his manifesto, the Martin killing prompted him to type in the words Black on white crime into Google, and he had not been the same since that day. Peddling out the 1350 statistic is dangerous. Misunderstanding it can be deadly. So, how can we explain it? For starters, understand that the statistic itself is referring to homicides only. It does not count for how Black people are arrested at a higher rate, Black people are also falsely incarcerated at a higher rate, and the war on drugs, for which white people and Black people use cannabis at roughly the same rate, yet Black people are 6 times, 8 times, or even 10 times more likely to be incarcerated for it. White-on-white crime is a far more prevalent issue than black-on-black crime. However, you never hear from people complaining that white people, more specifically white men if we go by the actual statistics, being exceptionally violent and dangerous. Additionally, because of historical practices such as gerrymandering, gentrification, and redlining, and many more, many Black Americans do not have access to generational wealth. We need to talk about that. Any conversation pertaining to history without this lens is a highly inaccurate one. Gerrymandering is a practice intended to establish an unfair political advantage for a particular party or group by manipulating district boundaries. Gentrification is a process of changing the character of a neighborhood through the influx of more affluent residents and businesses. It does lead to the increase in overall economic well-being of a neighborhood. However, it also does lead to severe demographic changes that affect minorities. Minorities end up being pushed out of affluent areas because they cannot keep up with elevating prices. Redlining is the systematic denial of various services by federal government agencies, local governments, as well as the private sector, either directly or through the selective raising of prices. In 1933, there was a housing shortage. The government itself worked to and supported an effort primarily designed to provide housing to white middle class and lower middle class families. I quote the author Richard Rothstein. It still affects communities today as, and I quote, "The segregation of our metropolitan areas today leads to stagnant inequality because families are much less able to be upwardly mobile when they are living in segregated neighborhoods where opportunity is absent." So, what does all this mean? Well, unjust poverty combined with systematic gatekeeping and oppression leads to higher crime rates, which is a survival tactic many times. How far back does this go? Well, since the birth of this nation, obviously, but let's talk about World War II. Black soldiers that fought in World War II, while highly regarded abroad, were not privy to the same social benefits like mortgage support, college tuition, and business loans that white World War II veterans received upon return to the United States. A lot were even attacked or lynched as a result of skyrocketing racial tensions. This wasn't just casual, on-the-street racism, not that that would have made it any better, for the record. They were discriminated against by the GI Bill, an official bill that was passed that actually discriminated against Black veterans. Additionally, when Social Security started in 1935, 65% of African Americans were excluded from it. That is more than half. The development of high-income white suburbs in the 20th century, with access to better education and other utilities, was a direct result of veteran benefits. This just goes to show how early on, African Americans were quite literally shut out of the benefits that they deserved. A terrible, cruel practice that had consequences of poverty, discrimination, crime, and violence for years to come. Since either A, these practices continue today, such as with gentrification, or B, their effects are still widespread and felt everywhere, such as with redlining, crime rates will not decrease either until correct and just reforms are made. Going back to the point of introducing this 1350 hoax, which was used to explain how propagandists use this to justify racist stereotypes and conflations, it's important to see that they are just those, stereotypes and conflations. They are not the seemingly cold, hard facts that they are advertised to be. And until we are able to perceive these terrible biases for what they are, we will never progress the conversation about how to tackle the real problems that have been plaguing African American communities for centuries, problems that they certainly cannot be held responsible for and deserve the chance to improve upon.
So some arguments people may bring up about defunding the police are Seattle's Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or Camden, New Jersey. Let's start off in Seattle. The Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, CHAZ, or later renamed to Capitol Hill Organized Protest, CHOP, is what some would refer to as a socialist summer camp. This is an abridged headline taken from the New York Post. I will be referring to what happened in Seattle as CHOP. CHOP was a short-lived piece of 2020 history, and well, what happened there? Now, as protests around the killing of George Floyd grew, more police involvement occurred as they hoped to extinguish protests from even happening. The police used violent tactics such as tear gas, driving through crowds, and just straight up force. Protests raged on for days until Monday, June 8, 2020. Police left the East Precinct in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood. They boarded it up and hoped protesters would destroy the building in hopes to create the image that protesters were this malicious group of anarchists. But protesters did the opposite. Protesters took control of the 6 blocks around the precinct and barred any police officers from entering. And for the next 11 days, people gathered to discuss police reforms or abolition, race inequalities. They supplied food and care to anyone who needed it. They had community teach-ins and performances. CHOP made quite the impact as they created a list of demands for the mayor of Seattle, which boiled down to defunding the police and putting more resources back into the community. But sadly, June 2020, a 19-year-old was shot in the CHOP neighborhood and later died upon arrival to the hospital. Another man was wounded. Police say they were met with a violent mob who denied them access to go in, while CHOP residents say they attempted to call the fire department, but they would not enter until the police arrived. And when they attempted to call the police did not respond quickly enough, so they had to drive the 19-year-old to the hospital. and over the weekend, 3 more shootings occurred. Motives and suspects for all shootings are unknown. On June 23rd, the other victim from the first shooting, 33-year-old Dehuan Young, was shot a block away from CHOP. He suspects that it was due to racism because they called him the N-word. Some say the eventual demise of CHOP is what will happen if we defund the police, that it will become an anarchist's wet dream. And there were too many outside variables, such as if there was outside racial tension, that led to the eventual closure. So, moving on to Camden, New Jersey, people have brought up Camden when discussing defunding the police. Due to a decreasing city budget, the city of Camden decided to abolish its police department, and instead they opted for more community-style policing, done through a new program led by the new county police. But there's a bit more to the story. Prior to 2012, Camden was constantly named one of the most dangerous cities in New Jersey for its high crime rates. We are led to believe that county cops know the neighborhoods they patrol and are seen at cookouts eating ice cream with civilians. However, many have criticized Camden's new tactics. Homicide rates have dropped. However, criminologists note that homicide rates have dropped nationwide, and people may just be getting to hospitals faster. Others criticize the heavier policing and surveillance, while others either say there is an improper data collection. So looking at county data, there's still a high budget allocated to the sheriff's department over community resources such as public parks. So in 2010, before the whole change in policing system, they had spent roughly $728,000 on police and $164,000 on parks. Meanwhile, in 2019, there was $2,267,000 allocated for the sheriff's department, while there was only $176,000 for parks. With everything going on, there's pressure on policymakers to make budget adjustments and rethink the entire police force. At the city level, we've seen politicians begin to discuss and talk about future plans. Because everything's still pretty new, nothing final has been set in stone yet. We've seen talks of going all the way up to defunding the police in cities such as Dallas and Minneapolis. Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed, city politicians are looking to revise their charters so that MPD is abolished. They also want to instill community safety and violence prevention. This new model is being written by the Future of Community Safety Work Group, a group that consists of staff from the Office of Violence Prevention, the Department of Civil Rights, the city's coordinate office, in coordination with the 911 Working Group, the Division of Race and Equity, Neighborhood and Community Relations, and other relevant departments. The final wording for whatever they create is to be set by August 21st. At the national level, we saw the Trump administration write an executive reform bill. The bill hopes to track police accountability better and is creating incentives for police departments to reform. These reviews would look at an agency's training practices, including use of force and de-escalation techniques, along with performance management and community engagement efforts. Deadly force used by officers must be recorded and implemented in a database. This database will also track things such as officer firings, conduct, and etc. The bill also cracks down harder on the use of chokeholds and other deadly force tactics, but it still leaves loopholes because of its vague wording. It never outright bans chokeholds, but it advises against it. So now that we have all of this, as we wait for city councils to create their policies, we remember to vote this November on who will be writing the federal bills that get passed and who can create county and city laws. Okay, so here we are.
We've laid all the cards out on the table.
We've made all our points.
Thank you for sticking with us through this journey, because it's certainly been a long one.
From here on out, it is you who decides the next move.
Will you be an active player, or simply let the cards fall, wherever they may?